What you're about to hear is not a fairy tale. It happened at one of the most exclusive fundraising galas in New York City, inside the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where a single dinner seat costs more than many families pay in rent for months. This is a place where the powerful believe everything can be bought, and on that night, a boundary was deliberately crossed. We'll take you inside the Temple of Dendur, where Khalid Al-Rashid, a Middle Eastern billionaire surrounded by flashbulbs and flattery, publicly turned a black waitress into entertainment with a dare disguised as a privilege. "If you dance, I'll marry you." He believed his status allowed him to define another person's worth with a single sentence. He was wrong. What Khalid didn't know was that he wasn't just insulting an anonymous waitress. He was challenging an artist forced into silence. Stay with us to hear a story of humiliation, spectacular talent, and the moment a black woman turned the spotlight of shame into a stage of triumph. Golden lights poured down onto the Temple of Dendur, inside the Metropolitan Museum of Art, gliding lightly over ancient marble blocks and reflecting off the glass, metal and silk surfaces of a gala reserved for those accustomed to standing at the center of the world. Floor-length gowns brushed softly against one another. Perfectly tailored black tuxedos moved slowly between white-clothed tables where wine was poured endlessly, and conversations about art, hedge funds, and reputation unfolded in voices low enough to avoid seeming boastful. In that setting, Arielle Johnson existed as part of the backdrop. She was a black waitress in a dark uniform, no jewelry, no accents, holding a tray and walking along pre-calculated paths. She moved with such precision that she left almost no trace, no bumps, no interruptions, no reason for anyone to look up. When she needed to appear, she appeared on cue. When her task was done, she withdrew before eyes could linger. Arielle paid no mind to the opulence around her, nor did she compare herself to the people laughing and talking in front of her. She didn't judge them, admire them, or daydream. In her mind, there was only the rhythm of the shift, which table needed water, which aisle had to stay clear, which tray needed replacing immediately. She focused on the weight on her wrist, on steady breathing, on keeping every movement clean and as economical as possible. If someone observant watched her for more than a beat, they would notice her posture always straight, but not tense, her body's center of gravity stable, as if trained long ago. When she turned or changed direction, each motion flowed without excess, as if her body knew exactly what it was doing without thought. Arielle didn't name it to herself, nor did she consider it special. To her, it was just another work night at the Met, where she completed her role in silence, invisible in a glittering world, not built to see people like her. And in that invisibility, the room continued its familiar orbit, with lights, music, and conversations revolving around those accustomed to being at the center. Then, without announcement, the room's attention began to shift, not toward a work of art or a speech, but toward another man entering, carrying the gravity that only those long accustomed to power possess. Khalid Al-Rashid appeared at the center of the space, as if the room had been designed to part for him alone. A Middle Eastern man in his 40s, tall, shoulders straight, his black tuxedo tailored so perfectly that it needed no flashy details to assert status. He was surrounded by familiar faces from New York's finance and art worlds. People who spoke to Khalid in slightly lower tones, laughed a bit more, and listened longer than necessary, while Arielle continued moving at the edges of the scene, unaware that the collision between these two opposing orbits was about to shatter the evening's seemingly unbreakable equilibrium. Khalid didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His presence alone created an invisible clearance where others instinctively adjusted their positions. As Arielle passed to refill glasses, Khalid's gaze lingered on her longer than a beat, not crude or blatant, but the cold curiosity of someone accustomed to appraising everything by value and possessibility. He observed how she moved, how she balanced the tray, how her body twisted lightly to avoid guests, and in that look there was no malice, only the unspoken assumption that she was part of the space arranged for his benefit. Like the lighting or background music, Khalid smiled, offered a vague compliment about rare grace in such a busy event, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, light enough to seem courteous. Arielle paused as protocol required, nodded with a brief polite response, and prepared to move on, but Khalid didn't let the moment pass. He leaned forward as if struck by an amusing idea, and this time his voice carried clearly, no longer private. "If you dance tonight, I'll marry you." The words were delivered with a confident smile, like a generous offer, as if marriage were a gift he could bestow on a whim, and he made no effort to hide that he wanted the whole room to hear. The surrounding sounds paused for a very brief moment, long enough for the words to ripple across the tables. A few laughs escaped, quick and forced, the reflex of those not wanting to spoil the mood. Others fell silent, pretending to focus on their wine or prior conversations, avoiding Ariel's eyes as if the incident didn't concern them. No one spoke up in protest. No one reminded Khalid that some boundaries shouldn't be crossed. For many in the room, it was just an odd moment, a power-tinged joke wrapped in polished wealth. Khalid remained standing there, eyes fixed on Ariel, awaiting her reaction with the certainty of someone who believed he had just extended a rare privilege. In his gaze, Ariel wasn't a person at work but an intriguing possibility now named, an anecdote for after dinner. And in that composure, in the way the insult was packaged as a seemingly noble invitation, the evening's central conflict quietly formed, hanging between the golden lights and the crowd's complicit silence. Khalid Al-Rashid did not retract his words, nor did he show embarrassment at the room's lukewarm response. On the contrary, he seemed to take the silence as encouragement. He turned slowly, raising his glass a bit higher, so those at nearby tables, then farther ones, could clearly see and hear. "This adveiled and sinuous a phase, nordi complescent, he sended he she was." Khalid's voice rang out again, this time with the tone of a shared public amusement, light but unmistakable, as if adding spice to an overly smooth evening. "I just told her," he said, half joking, half serious, his eyes scanning the curious faces around him. "If she dances tonight, I'll marry her." A few louder laughs followed, more relaxed because when a man like Khalid said something with such assurance, others tended to assume it was merely the eccentricity of power, not something to question. Chairs shifted slightly. A few people leaned forward. Several gazes began converging on the same point. Ariel sensed it before she could think, feeling the clear weight of the changing air around her. She stood in the aisle, the tray in her hand suddenly superfluous, and for the first time that evening, she was no longer part of the background. The room seemed to shrink, every look converging on her with varying shades: curiosity, amusement, pity, and the indifferent coldness of those accustomed to watching power do as it pleased. Ariel clearly felt the layers of oppression stacking in that moment, without anyone needing to name them. She was a black woman in a space built by and for people who never had to question whether they belonged. She was a service worker among those who could command without asking permission, and she was a woman being positioned as an object, appraised, selected, bartered with a marriage promise, uttered like a jest. None of them asked if she wanted to be the center, nor considered what those words had stripped from her. In that moment, Ariel didn't think of rebutting Khalid, nor imagine storming off or slamming the tray down. She didn't feel the explosive anger others might expect, nor intend to make herself a victim to force guilt. The only thing clear in her mind was the familiar sensation of being seen through, assigned a role already scripted by others, and a quiet determination that this time she would not disappear that way. She remembered other long evenings in other spaces, where she had learned to shrink herself to survive, to stay silent, so as not to disturb, to stand in the right spot to avoid notice. But she also remembered something else, something her body had never forgotten, even when life forced her to set it aside. Khalid's voice still echoed somewhere behind, mingling with whispers and soft laughs, as if the entire room were waiting to see what she would do next, waiting to see if she would fluster, apologize, or find an excuse to retreat. Ariel drew in a slow breath, feeling her soles press firmly into the cold stone floor, feeling her weight distribute evenly, as if standing on an invisible boundary only she recognized. She lifted her head, not in defiance, but to look directly at the reality before her, at the man who believed he had just seized control, and at the crowd that had unwittingly granted him complicity through silence. When she spoke, her voice was no louder than necessary, unwavering, carrying neither the sarcasm nor anger many might have expected. Okay, just one word, short and clear, falling into the room, like a small stone enough to create widening ripples. The background music continued playing somewhere, but it grew distant, faded, no longer able to cover as before. The laughs that had rung out seconds earlier stopped abruptly, revealing their own awkwardness. No one hurried to add anything. No one clapped or reacted in the controlled way typical of such a tightly managed gala. Khalid Al-Rashid stood still, his glass paused mid-air longer than usual, the confident smile on his lips not vanishing but slowing, as if hitting something unplanned. He was accustomed to others, either flustering, trying to please, or quickly withdrawing to avoid trouble. Ariel's acceptance came too cleanly, too calmly, without any sign of fear or eagerness, and that very quality made Khalid look at her longer this time, searching for a clue to explain it. He saw no defiance in her, no gratitude, only an unreadable stillness, like calm water that wasn't shallow. Around them, the crowd began readjusting postures. Those who had chuckled now tilted heads, lowered voices, eyes shifting from Khalid to Ariel and back, as if watching a chess game where the first move had been made but no one knew the next. Curiosity gradually replaced the initial schadenfreude, not the harmless kind of a side anecdote, but a vague sense that something was slipping from its familiar path. A few realized they had just witnessed a moment they shouldn't have treated as entertainment, yet lacked the courage to speak and break the thick atmosphere. Ariel remained in place, saying no more, not rushing to prove anything. She set the tray down on the nearest table out of professional habit, the motions slow and precise, as if everything were still proceeding in the normal order of a shift. That very normality heightened the tension, refusing the room an easy escape. No one was sure anymore that this was just harmless joking, but no one was ready to name what else was forming. Khalid lowered his glass, his eyes quickly scanning the surrounding faces before returning to Ariel, carrying for the first time a trace of caution he himself couldn't yet name. The room held that silence, stretching beyond polite limits, no one rushing to fill it, like a breath held just before something irrevocable happens. In that charged void, all gazes gradually settled, no longer flickering among powerful faces, but quietly converging on a single point. And just when that anticipation reached its limit, Ariel was the first to act, not to respond with words, but to redefine the rhythm of the moment. She bent down very slightly, as if merely performing a familiar work motion, and placed the remaining tray on the edge of the nearest table, ensuring it stood steady, aligned, without making a sound. Then she reached back to untie the knot of her apron behind her back, her fingers working calmly, without haste, without trembling, as if she had tied and untied that knot hundreds of times before. When the apron was removed, she folded it neatly and placed it on the table, not tossing it, not letting it drop, not turning the action into a dramatic gesture. A few eyes in the room flickered slightly, as if they had just realized something was no longer following the familiar script. Ariel straightened up, drew in a deep breath, then bent down again to remove the black service shoes that had accompanied her through countless shifts. She took them off one by one, placing them side by side under the table, toes pointing outward, meat to the point where it couldn't be seen as careless. The cold marble floor touched the soles of her bare feet, a clear, real sensation that pulled her fully into the present. No one stepped forward to stop her. No one signaled that she should halt. The managers standing at the room's edges seemed frozen in their roles, unsure whether this still fell within the scope of work they could intervene in. Khalid Al-Rashid watched the entire process with an unreadable expression, the thin smile on his lips not fully extinguished, but his eyes had lost their initial ease. Ariel didn't look at him as she completed the final motions, nor did she turn toward the crowd to seek attention or approval. She simply stood there, bearing no signs of the server identity the room had been accustomed to assigning her from the start of the evening. Removing the apron and shoes didn't transform her into someone else in an instant, but it stripped away the invisible shell that had defined how everyone saw her. No longer holding a tray, no longer covered by the uniform, Ariel stood in the Temple of Dendur with a straight and calm posture, as if she had just stepped out of a role she had never voluntarily accepted. A few people in the crowd shifted, not to move closer, but to create distance, as if that change made them uncertain about who they were now facing. No one clapped, no one spoke, and that very absence of reaction highlighted the meaning of what had just occurred. This wasn't a loud rebellion, nor a defiant statement challenging power, but a quiet, decisive shedding, refusing to continue playing the role imposed on her body and presence. Ariel clearly felt every point of contact between her body and the surrounding space, felt her weight distributed evenly on her bare feet, felt her back straighten without straining. She didn't think about whether this action would discomfort anyone, nor calculate how it would be interpreted. To her, it was simply the necessary next step, a wordless preparation for what she had agreed to do. In that moment, the boundary between server and seen person was officially erased, not by anyone's permission in the room, but by Ariel's calm decision. A musician glanced toward the conductor, eyes questioning, and without lengthy explanation, a slight nod was given, not according to the official program script, but by the instinct of those accustomed to reading the atmosphere. The music's rhythm changed almost imperceptibly in its starting moment, with no announcement, no guiding applause, just a silent shift from polite background melody to a slower, deeper tempo, carrying low drum beats and sustained chords as if opening a different space within the same room. The atmosphere of the Temple of Dendur immediately transformed, no longer a backdrop for social conversations, but focused, compressed, as if all excess sounds had been pushed aside to make way for what was about to happen. A few guests looked up upon realizing the music no longer suited talking. Others fell silent unconsciously, sensing this was no longer a moment for interjecting laughs or superficial comments. Khalid Al-Rashid turned his head toward the band, eyebrows slightly raised at the change, but showing no displeasure. On the contrary, a fleeting satisfaction crossed his face, as if everything was proceeding exactly as he expected. In Khalid's mind, the music rising was a clear sign that the dare had been fully accepted, that this room, with all its lights and powerful people, was still operating in the familiar orbit where he was the center. He stood a bit straighter, adjusting his cuff, a small but possessive gesture, as if preparing to enjoy a performance staged for him alone. Ariel remained still, not rushing into movement, allowing the music to seep through the space and reach her body first, like an invitation that needed no words. She felt the layers of sound overlapping, the drums echoing lightly in her chest, the strings lingering in the air, and that change made the room seem to contract, more focused, closer. The surrounding eyes began shifting with the music's rhythm, no longer looking at Khalid with initial amusement, but unconsciously turning toward Ariel, waiting, though they themselves couldn't yet name what they were waiting for. A few still smiled, seeing this as a rare entertainment moment in an overly smooth evening, but those smiles were no longer as certain as before, because the music had stripped away the joking veneer and exposed an undeniable seriousness. Khalid, meanwhile, held on to his belief that this game belonged to him, that all eyes on Ariel were merely the prelude to an event he had named. He didn't realize that the subtle change in rhythm, the room's silent listening instead of mocking laughter, had begun shifting the center of power from its familiar place. The music continued to spread, filling the gaps between the stone columns, reflecting off the still water of the pool inside the Temple of Dendur, creating a feeling both ancient and present, as if this space was being prepared for a ritual rather than entertainment. Ariel didn't plunge into movement as soon as the rhythm settled. She let another moment pass, standing still on the cold stone, as if listening to something deeper than the sounds filling the room. Then very slowly, almost imperceptibly in its starting second, she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a motion so small it could be mistaken for adjusting posture. No strong spin, no attention-grabbing extension, just a subtle change in how her body occupied space. A few eyes in the crowd narrowed slightly, as they had expected something clearer, a more understandable performance suited to instant entertainment. Ariel raised her arm, not high, not fast, fingers relaxed as if tracing a faint curve in the air, then lowered it to the low drum beat, holding the motion at the end longer than a beat, as if deliberately prolonging the anticipation. A few exchanged glances, initial smiles fading, replaced by mild skepticism from those unsure if they were witnessing something worth attention. This wasn't like the performances they were used to at galas. No ostentation, no obvious display of technique, and that made some begin to feel impatient. Khalid Al-Rashid remained in place, observing calmly, his eyes following Ariel's movements but not truly focused, as if waiting for the performance to really start. He saw nothing in those slow steps beyond clumsy preparation, and his familiar confidence kept him in the state of an appreciator rather than one drawn in. But as Ariel continued moving, each small motion began connecting in a logic not everyone grasped immediately. The way she turned didn't cut space into sharp angles, but bent it, making the emptiness between the stone columns seem to shift with her breath. Her back, straight but not rigid, head slightly tilted, gaze not on the crowd but focused inward. Each bare footstep on the floor was sure, without hesitation, and that sureness began creating an indefinable feeling in the observers, a sense that this body was not out of rhythm, despite the outwardly minimalist movement. A few guests stopped smiling altogether, wine glasses paused mid-air, as they realized Ariel wasn't dancing to impress or please anyone. She kept a slow, restrained pace, but in that restraint was absolute control, as if each motion had been carefully selected before allowed to appear. When she lowered her center, knees bending slightly, then rose straight in one fluid motion, those with experience began recognizing the discipline hidden beneath the simplicity, a discipline impossible without serious training. The crowd grew quieter, not because required, but because they began feeling their own voices no longer fit the space being created. Skeptical looks hadn't vanished entirely, but their tone had shifted, not mocking doubt, but cautious curiosity, as if trying to understand what was unfolding before them. Ariel continued, without speeding up, without suddenly expanding the range of motion. She let her body speak in short sentences, small ideas, patiently building a language not everyone was fluent in. Her arm extended then retracted, not to dominate space, but to measure it, as if testing the room's elasticity, seeing how it would respond to her presence. A few began realizing they were watching something different from ordinary dancing, that those movements carried a depth not easily grasped in the first seconds. Khalid, at this point, tilted his head slightly, eyes more focused, no longer distracted, as he sensed the atmospheric change, though not fully understanding its cause. He still believed he controlled the game, that this was just a longer than expected prelude. But that certainty began showing tiny cracks when he realized he was no longer the center of attention in the familiar way. Ariel didn't look toward him, nor seek validation from anyone in the room. She moved with absolute autonomy, as if the room now existed only as a temporary frame for the story her body was telling. Each subsequent motion gradually clarified what had initially been a vague feeling. This was a trained body, a muscle memory accumulated over years, an understanding of rhythm and space impossible by improvisation. The crowd, though not fully conquered, began leaning forward, literally and figuratively, drawn into a process they didn't control. Doubt lingered, but it had shifted from what is she doing to what will she do next. As the music shifted to a higher layer, Ariel didn't accelerate suddenly, but allowed her body to open deeper, as if the previous movements were only the outer layer of a more complex story waiting to be told. Her center lowered further, bare feet gripping the cool stone firmly, and from that stability, her body erupted in powerful, decisive curves, not violent, but absolutely controlled in every spin. Her arms no longer merely traced faint lines in the air but began cutting through space with clear intent, sometimes extending like an invitation, sometimes closing tight like a defense honed over time. The crowd now had no whispers, no light clinking glasses, as all excess sounds became out of place before the increasingly clear breath of the dance. Ariel let her body speak of things words often couldn't contain, about history etched into the muscle fibers of people like her, those who had learned to stand firm in a world not built for them. There were moments she paused in a taut pose, back arched, head held high, gaze upward toward the space between ancient columns, then suddenly released, letting her body drop and rise like a wave, evoking the sense of collapse and rebirth, repeated across generations. Each foot stamping the floor wasn't just rhythmic emphasis, but a quiet affirmation of presence, of the right to claim space with her own body. Those with knowledge began recognizing that Ariel's technique didn't belong to one school. It was an intersection of academic discipline and deep influences from Black culture, where movement is always tied to story, collective memory, and survival. When she spun at high speed, the simple service skirt clung to the motion, not hiding but highlighting the precision in every axis, every calculated stop to the fraction of a second. Sweat began glistening on her forehead under the golden lights, not as a sign of fatigue, but as proof of full commitment, of pouring everything she had into this moment. Khalid Al-Rashid, at this point, no longer stood at the center of any circle of attention. His eyes still followed Ariel, but had lost the confidence of a game master, replaced by growing confusion, as he realized every gaze in the room had irrevocably slipped from him. Those who had chuckled earlier now stood motionless, some unconsciously placing hands on chests, as if Ariel's movement was touching something deeper than ordinary appreciation. Her dance grew more intense, not through chaos, but through razor-sharp precision, each beat a reminder of pains transformed into strength, of beauty that needed no permission to exist. She let her spine arch, then snap straight, hips swing powerfully, then halt abruptly, creating pauses in motion that made viewers hold their breath, because in those pauses, meaning was most exposed. At times Ariel moved close to the ground, body nearly touching the floor, evoking the image of lowly status society had imposed. Then in one beat, she rose high, claiming the upper space, like a wordless retort. The room now fell into absolute silence, not forced but the silence of people drawn into an experience beyond initial expectations.